Friends, today's NRI Samai program from Los Angeles brought to you commercial free by listeners like you. Your generous donations make possible for us to stay commercial free, and today's show is pre-recorded. If you have a question for the guest, please send an email to nrisamai@gmail.com. We will follow up with the guest and find the answer for you. Thank you for your support.
A very warm welcome to all our listeners on NRI. This is your host, Suresh. At a time when journalism has become more about TRP ratings or about creating sensation in the midst, the real important news always gets left out. Amidst this kind of a situation, under these circumstances, there are some rural women, or I would say they are the real journalists, who are creating a space for themselves to bring out the real stories that matter their day-to-day lives. And today we are extremely fortunate to have amongst us Disha, who is a coordinator and has been one of the founders working with Khabar Lahariya for the past 7 years and helping the rural women, train them to bring out these stories. So we'll talk more about this initiative, how did she get involved, and learn about their fascinating journey. Disha, welcome to NRI Samai.
Thank you.
All right, so it's kind of, as I was saying in the introduction, we are living in a time where news has become more about either it has to be a breaking news or something more sensation to even get the attention of the viewer or the reader if it's a print media. How did you even think about having rural women come out with this kind of a journal or a newspaper, and you thought that this would sustain itself?
Well, the sustainability question maybe we should speak about separately. But the idea of a newspaper came from the fact that it was a kind of an educational journey because we were working on education with rural women. And when we were working on education, we realized that once women get literate or are literate, there's very little printed material to read in remote rural areas. And especially that's comes from the context of rural women and marginalized communities, and which is in their local language. So it came from the idea of having, if rural women were to create their own printed material and content, then they would maybe be able to sustain their literacy because it would be material that they were interested in reading. And from there it kind of evolved into the fact that there's very little media available and news and information available in rural areas. That if women were the ones creating the news, then they would also be brought into the public domain of asking for accountability from democratic institutions. And so the journey kind of started from maybe the need to have educational material that was created by rural women into having rural women in the public domain creating and generating news. So that was the idea. I think that it's in the past 10 years, it's taken on a speed of its own. Once we started one edition with 5 or 6 journalists, and we started training them in reporting and interviewing and photography and establishing them as journalists in areas where there are no women journalists. I mean, even now in the areas that Khabar Lahariya and these journalists are established, there are no other women working as full-time reporters.
And which areas these women cover specifically when you say these are, there's no sort of media coverage there? What exactly are we talking here? What kind of areas you're referring to?
So Khabar Lahariya is located in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar states of India, which are 2 of the largest states in North India, and they're also 2 of the most populous and most underdeveloped states. So there's very patchy levels of development. There are large areas where there's very, very little basic amenities. So in terms of education, health, infrastructure, unemployment, there are also high levels of violence, caste-based violence, community-based violence, religious or communal violence. So these are the kind of contexts. And within Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, both are very large states, so we work in small pockets of these. So in Uttar Pradesh, we work in the Bundelkhand region, which is south-central Uttar Pradesh on the border of Madhya Pradesh, which is again a very underdeveloped and poor, it's very drought-prone area of UP. And in Bihar, we work in North Bihar along the Nepal border, which is also very remote and has Maoist kind of Naxal influences. So episodes of violence are very common. So those are the areas that we work in.
So given how remote they are and how, if I may say, also economically backward, let's say you train the women to, bring out these stories and you educate them, you also need to find the readers for these kind of stories, right? So how do you address that problem?
Yeah. I think the readers and the demand has always been really strong, and it's maybe been a driving force for wanting to sustain the Khabar Lahariya project. There's always been a deep and popular kind of community readership for Khabar Lahariya. There isn't any other media. I mean, in the past decade or so, I think that the media penetration has also changed in rural areas. But there's no local media in this, and local independent media in the nature of Khabar Lahariya. There's no other media in the local language. So Khabar Lahariya is produced in a different language in each district that it's produced in. So even if it's there are 2 editions in adjacent areas, just maybe 50 miles apart, the language will still be different because the language changes quite rapidly. So there's a really strong connection between the readers and the newspaper. They see it as their newspaper. They see it as a forum where their stories and their news is being covered, whereas other mainstream media only covers, like you said, sensational kind of breaking news. So if a politician lands in a helicopter in a remote rural area just to, make an appearance, then that will appear in a mainstream newspaper, maybe on the front page or but stories from villages and small towns in these remote areas don't get covered. So communities in these areas see Khabar Lahariya as their newspaper. There's also a big readership who's semi-literate and has not had has had access to formal education. So Khabar Lahariya's typeface and design and content is also catered to an audience which maybe is semi-literate, does not read that much, and so there's a vast kind of population who doesn't. Mainstream news is the language and the style and the design of it is catered to an educated upper caste kind of readership. There are vast pockets of people who are kind of media dark. I mean, far from that kind of media. So we've also tried to have a readership of women and even men from marginalized communities, so Dalits and Muslims and tribals reading the newspaper or accessing media is not really part of what their lives. So also to bring them into the fold of media and news and information. So that's also our readership.
So your paper is in fact more localized than any other paper can ever get, because you're reporting in the local language. You're also very conscious about the fact that people are semi-literate. So your paper is in fact putting in more effort in also trying to reach out to a wider audience.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, I think that we've worked in that area for a long time now, over a decade now, and we've also seen that media patterns have changed. Now even in deep remote rural areas where there's no water, no electricity, but people will have mobile phones. There'll be more mobile phones than one in a household. And there are newspapers reaching deeper than they did maybe 10 years ago. There are stringers from mainstream newspapers who are in smaller towns, and so there is news coming in. But the economic structure of media, at least in India, is that by the time you get to small towns and district locations, and especially villages, there's very little money that filters down. So you don't have full-time paid staff or reporters who are reporting from rural areas, because that news is not really what people in urban centers, or it's not news that pays for itself. It's not news that generates advertising and interests the market, which sustains big media. And
Right.
so you don't have that much news coming in from those areas, and you don't have full-time reporters trained to be based and reporting from those areas. So our interest is in establishing local women who will be located in deep rural areas, and who will also, it's their job to be going, however, I mean, whether there are roads or no roads, but to be going into villages and reporting news that otherwise nobody else reports. So yeah, our interest is in the local.
But isn't that also kind of a challenge for you to even get the local women out, especially when you said that these are like really remote and backward areas? Are the women given that kind of a freedom to operate in a predominantly male-dominated society? Is that a challenge that you have seen?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. It's one of the I think at the core of Khabar Lahariya is the fact that if women can be trained and can have these kinds of skills, high-level media skills, then that's something that's really transformative, because it's not just about them going out and reporting and producing a newspaper, but it's about being part of opinion making and being part of information generation in these areas. And it's definitely challenging, because it's not a profession or a form of work, an occupation that's common in those areas. Even if women are stepping out to work, and they have in the past couple of decades, it's been for government jobs or teaching jobs, which are considered, okay for women to be. The timings are fixed, and you get like a good stable salary, and that's respectable. And as a journalist, you have no sense of timings. You can be working at all hours. You're very mobile. You're roaming around and talking to all kinds of people, men and women. So it's deeply challenging in a social context that's very conservative. Most of the women that we hire are Dalit, so they come from what's considered almost outside of the caste hierarchy in India. So for them to have high-level skills, and for them to be questioning men who are most often upper caste and in positions of power, like the local administration, and interacting with other journalists, is very challenging. I mean, they routinely face a lot of opposition when they're out in the field. Their cameras will be snatched from them. There have been episodes of violence and threat. And it's like this continuously. I mean, I know that there are women who've been trained and who are reporters in our team for 10 years or more. And there are also young women who've joined along the way. And I think that the newspaper is known in the areas where we've been around for a while, but it's constantly a challenge. I mean, new people, new women who we hire still encounter resistance from their families. Even women who've been with us for many years, face resistance from their families about the nature of the work that they do, and why do they come back late, and why do they have to stay in the office and all night when they're sending the newspaper to press and things like that. It's just it's a very subversive kind of profession for women to be in, I think.
So how do you handle it, or how do the women handle it, or do you even train the women to handle this kind of situations, or they are in a way by the time confident enough to be able to deal with this kind of questions, or deal with this kind of male-dominated hysteria?
Yeah. I think that the trainings that we do definitely have a component of what it means to be a woman from a marginalized community, set up as a journalist, and what challenges she might have to face. It's also the process is quite resource intensive, so it's not like we do one training or workshop and then we move away and then we leave them to fend for themselves. So there's a lot of ongoing hand-holding and mentoring that happens as part of working with them. There's also senior members of the team now who've been through the same journey themselves, and so there's local mentoring that happens. If people have problems with their families, then senior team members will go and counsel their families and tell them that, that this is a great opportunity and profession for these women to be in. So there's that local kind of hand-holding. There's from our team, the training team, we also travel to the field often, and it's an ongoing kind of support mechanism. But I think that just the nature of the work and the opportunities that they're exposed to, whether they're trainings in reporting and information that they may not have had prior to being in Khabar Lahariya, it's also technical skills, using the computer, using the internet, using cameras. It's a whole world of modern information that they're exposed to, and I think that it's hugely empowering. So if because of their work they have to travel, they have to come to Delhi, they have to go to Bombay, they have to travel between districts and outside of their villages, that those processes I think are really really confidence generating. I mean, a lot of the women have really changed over the time that they've been in Khabar Lahariya, so that a lot of confidence comes from that and being able to speak with people in positions of authority and question them from positions of knowledge. They know, for example, if there's a government scheme that's supposed to provide employment, then they know the terms of those schemes. They know what should be coming in, what budgets should be coming in, and for what, and whether that money has been spent on what it's supposed to be spent on. So they're in a position of knowledge, which is really empowering for them. We do a lot of reporting on violence against women, which now in the last couple of years is also in the mainstream media, I think, because of a couple of cases. But Khabar Lahariya has been reporting on violence against women in remote areas for a decade now. So they know what challenges that there are when women go to police stations and try and report domestic or violence outside the home. What laws there are, what laws should be preventing that kind of violence, and how that doesn't get implemented. So I think that both having information and having skills that they didn't have and being able to travel, all these things make their confidence levels different from what they were maybe before. And so they are able to challenge even men with guns.
Friends, NRI Samay is a non-profit independent alternate media from Los Angeles, USA, which brings positive stories from grassroots activists from all corners of India and across the world. Among others, we focus on stories of need for equality, inspiration, environment, health, and politics. NRI Samay does not rely on corporate funding, and thus our shows are commercial free. We only rely on your donations. Please consider donating to NRI Samay, and all donations are kept transparent on nrisamay.com.
What kind of stories do the women report, and do you have any anecdotes or any incidents that wherein the Khabar Lahariya highlighted something and it created that kind of a pressure, either to in this example questioning the bureaucrats or even questionning the village authorities, the local heads? Has any of that happened in the past 7 years?
Yeah. There's a lot of impact that happens with Khabar Lahariya's reportage, and I think that a lot of it is because the stories come from areas where there isn't any other media. So Khabar Lahariya is the only media that's highlighting maybe a developmental or other local issue. And also the local administration in those districts, they're all readers of Khabar Lahariya, and they know that the women go themselves into these areas and report. So it's if you ask a Khabar Lahariya reader or ask local communities in those areas, they'll say that Khabar Lahariya's reporting is true and it's objective because they've gone and seen situations which other media doesn't. And so there's a lot of credibility of the news that gets broken in Khabar Lahariya, and I think the result of that is that the administration takes action. But for example, in the last couple of months, the rainfall this year as well was quite poor in that area, and a lot of the farmers are dependent on government subsidized irrigation. So canals and stuff are built in that area to release water when it's needed. And I think that the local administration had delayed the opening of the release of water in the canals. And Khabar Lahariya wrote about this, and the local official in the water board or the irrigation board found out that Khabar Lahariya was reporting on it. So before the story actually, that issue went to press, he called the editor of that, the Chitrakoot edition, and said that I know that Khabar Lahariya is reporting on this, and we were about to release the water in a day or two. So please don't break the story. So, I mean, that was just interesting, because usually we talk about stories getting written again and again in Khabar Lahariya, and then finally the administration takes impact or gets to know about it. And so wages will get released, or roads will get made, or electricity transformers will get replaced. But this was an instance that the credibility of Khabar Lahariya was so strong that the action actually got taken before the news even was broken.
That's impressive. So that's impressive. So has it happened in these 7 years? As you said, there are a lot of challenges and there are a lot of issues, and there are also these positive stories that you bring out. But I'm sure there is also a lot of frustration that comes along with this kind of a nature of what you're trying to do. What do you tell yourself? Like, what keeps you going? I mean, you are based, if I'm not mistaken, you're based out of Delhi, and you're working in these places probably people might not even have heard about. So how do you sort of strike a balance?
I think the work is really, it's very stimulating and it's very exciting, and there's such a strong need for, I mean, in this political climate even, the need for independent media and media that's produced by people outside of the cities that we live in to reflect the situation in terms of development, in terms of social and economic and political situations. It feels really important to be bringing stories out which aren't getting covered by mainstream news. So that in and of itself, I think that confronts some of the frustrations. I think that one thing which is a big challenge and frustration at the moment, and is also a stimulus, is that Khabar Lahariya in the past has been a development project that's been supported by grants, and those grant cycles are now at an end. So it's also a point where we're revisioning the newspaper and the organization that houses it, and thinking about how this kind of a newspaper can be scaled up a little bit, expanded, so that its impact also grows, and so the newspaper becomes more sustainable, because it's difficult to sustain something that's so small. So it's a challenge because people don't see it as direct development. You know, you're not going into a remote area which needs health care or education and opening schools or clinics. You're training women to be reporters and bring out news, and so it's a long-term spiral of empowerment and maybe improving democratic processes and empowering women. So to pitch that as a long-term kind of, not solution, but an idea for dealing with injustice and inequality and some of the social and economic issues that we have in India has been difficult, and we've been working on, you know, like creative ways to set Khabar Lahariya up as a sustainable enterprise.
Right.
So how can you make a grassroots community-based newspaper sustainable, because you don't want to be entirely dependent on advertising from local businesses or national businesses. It's really difficult for newspapers to sustain themselves only on sales. No newspaper, I think, in the world sustains itself only on sales and subscriptions.
Right.
So what's the model that can be created for something like Khabar Lahariya? Because we also believe that it's important for women to be trained, and that costs money. It's also important for women to have full-time salaries so that they can justify doing this kind of work. And most of the women that we employ in Khabar Lahariya support their families. Nobody else in their families work. So so that's really frustrating, and that's also the stimulus, I think, for me and my colleagues who work in Delhi to be dealing with right now. Also increasing marketing and pushing Khabar Lahariya out from maybe a kind of a cocoon. It's always been seen as a really interesting boutique kind of project, but to push it out of that comfort zone into the market, and increase its distribution even locally, have it as a competitive kind of newspaper in the districts where it's been around for 5, 10, 15 years, to be talking to distributing agents of mainstream newspapers and ask them to partner with us and help us build our circulation. So I think that this is one of the maybe the frustrations, which is also the reason that the fuel that's keeping us going at the moment, that it's a really important newspaper and it needs to grow.
No wonder you saved when I said about sustenance, you wanted to talk later in the beginning, and now I understand.
Yeah.
So has it ever happened that the mainstream media or even the local media that's out there saw you as a challenge? I mean, more so the local mainstream media there has seen you as a challenge?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we've had instances where we've covered stories, so questioning the actions of local politicians, which mainstream media would not, because the more deep you go into smaller towns or in villages, then the power that local politicians and local administration has, those circles become smaller and smaller. So the impact of your actions, whether you're writing about a local official or someone in power, it could be very, very direct. And Khabar Lahariya has been able to raise questions against local politicians and local officials. And often local media has said, how dare you write about this kind of story, or, so we've had that kind of how dare you from various levels of, I think that because these are women journalists and often they're Dalit or tribal women journalists, then there is a sense that they're out of place to be asking those questions and to be writing. We also have local journalists who now have a good rapport with the Khabar Lahariya reporters, and will take stories because they admit that they don't have the bandwidth or time to go into the remote rural areas and get first-hand news. They mostly get their news over the telephone or through their own networks. So they'll take our stories, and sometimes they acknowledge and credit us, and often they don't. Which also we see as some kind of compliment, as Khabar Lahariya has established itself, its news and its credibility has also increased.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing interesting is that it's an all-out women rural journalist. Anything against including the men in the group? Because if you have the local men also part of your team, maybe it won't be that much of a resistance coming from the local communities, or this was a deliberate attempt to only empower the women and hence empower the family or the society?
I think that one of the a big part of our vision and our objective is to bring women into the domain of journalism, and so in terms of training and hiring full-time women reporters and journalists and editors, I think it will always only be women, because there are enough opportunities for men to come into this field. But in terms of the wider impact and of Khabar Lahariya, I mean, our readers are predominantly men. They're not women, because literacy levels in that area are very low, and it's not a habit of women to sit with the newspaper. So in terms of indirect impact, or readership is direct impact of a newspaper, I think it's involves men, and men are some of our strongest supporters of Khabar Lahariya. even in terms of partnerships that we have with other local organizations or with the journalist networks, we do work with men, and we know that it's important for the newspaper to be established in a wider context. But yeah, in terms of training and in terms of having people on the roles, I think that the focus will always be women, and women who come from marginalized communities, because those opportunities just don't exist, and it needs to be pushed.
Now, before I let you go, what made you go down this path? You could have chosen to be in Delhi and done something, maybe, pick up mainstream media or anything else. But what led you down this road? And 7 years later, do you think you've made the sort of a right choice? I mean, do you even look back at the decisions that you've made?
I don't reconsider the decision, and it's always been exciting and fulfilling. I think I did work with mainstream media for a while, and I think it was an important experience, and I still do interact with mainstream media. I sometimes freelance with mainstream media. But I think the experience of Khabar Lahariya, and now in this phase of Khabar Lahariya, also trying to bridge what Khabar Lahariya is doing at the hyper-local level and seeing how that can impact mainstream media, and can mainstream media take from any of these stories, or can we supplement what they're doing with what we do with these voices and these stories. I think that's an exciting part of it, and I think that being able to travel to areas which, like you said, people in Delhi, I mean, I hadn't heard of most of these areas before I started traveling there. That's really exciting. I mean, like 70 or 75% of India lives outside of big metropolitan cities. So I think I'm lucky to have the opportunity of knowing worlds other than my own world, and having friends and colleagues outside of people that I know in Delhi. So it feels really enriching, and it feels more whole as both a professional and a personal choice. So I haven't looked back on it. Yeah.
Well, we hope you never look back and keep going forward along with your team of rural journalists.
Thank you.
And Disha, thanks very much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And for all our listeners, in case you want to know more about Khabar Lahariya, you can go to khabarlahariya.in. Khabar as in news, Khabar, Lahariya as in waves, Lahariya.in. Thank you once again.
Friends, if you liked today's show, please go to youtube.com/NRI Samay and click on the subscribe button. You will get notified every time we publish a new show. And you can also like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+.